I stood below the stage and watched a trophy with my own name earned on it get placed into another man's hands. $18.7 million in sales. That was mine. Preston Sterling had not closed half of it, yet his mother smiled at 400 employees and called him the future of Astron. When I asked about the rankings published 1 week earlier, Vivian Sterling looked at me and said that men in my position should know when to step aside. I did not argue. I folded the results page and slid it into my jacket. 3 days later, the chairman called her. If you want to watch a single father turn a public humiliation into a reversal nobody saw coming, subscribe right now. My name is Grant Keller. I am 42 years old, and for 11 years I sold industrial equipment for Astron Systems without ever being the loudest man in the building. I did not golf with the executive floor. I did not wear a watch worth more than my car. I did not post pictures of myself standing beside clients in hotel lobbies. What I did was answer the phone at 6 in the morning when a plant manager in Ohio had a conveyor line down and a shift of 90 people standing around doing nothing. That was the whole of my strategy, and it was not a strategy at all. It was just the only way I knew how to work. Because of that, the accounts nobody else wanted always drifted toward my desk. The angry ones. The ones with a history of 3 failed account leads and a procurement director who opened every call by listing our failures in chronological order. Nolan Pierce, our vice president of sales, used to hand me those files with a small apologetic shrug, as if he were passing me a plate of something spoiled. I took them anyway. Within a year, most of them stopped being problems. And within 2 years, most of them were spending more with us than they ever had before. Nobody wrote a memo about that. The numbers simply moved, quietly, in the right direction. That year was the best year of my career, and I knew it before anyone told me. $18.7 million in closed revenue. 164% of quota. 3 accounts that had 1 foot out the door and were now signing multi-year renewals. A brand new relationship with Hawthorne Freight, a logistics group with terminals in 14 states, which I had chased for 9 months through 4 rejections and 1 canceled meeting. Not a single formal service complaint against my name in the entire fiscal cycle. I did not have to guess where I stood. The internal dashboard told me every Monday morning. The award at the end of that year was called Top Seller of the Year. And it was not just a piece of engraved crystal. It carried a bonus of $75,000, an option grant that vested over 4 years, and something more valuable than either, automatic consideration for the Senior Vice President Development track. For most of the floor, that was prestige. For me, it was arithmetic. My wife died 6 years ago, and I have been raising our daughter by myself since she was 7. That bonus meant the roof got replaced before another winter. It meant a college fund that was not a hope, but a number. I never told anyone in the office that, because the moment you explain why you need something, people start deciding whether you deserve it. Derek Sloan, who sat 2 desks over and had been my closest friend at the company for 9 years, figured most of it out on his own without me saying a word. He was the kind of man who noticed which lunches I skipped. In late October, he leaned back in his chair, looked at the leaderboard on the wall monitor, and said they might as well retire the category and rename it the Grant Keller Award. I laughed and told him not to jinx it. That is the last time I remember feeling relaxed inside that building. Preston Sterling started appearing around then. He was 28, the chief executive's son, and he had been given the title Director of Strategic Accounts 11 months after joining a company where most people wait 9 years to lead a region. He was not stupid. He was not even unpleasant in a direct way. He was simply a young man who had never in his life encountered a door that did not open when he approached it, and so he had never learned what doors are for. He began showing up in pipeline reviews he had never attended, sitting near the head of the table, asking questions that had already been answered in the deck. The first genuine warning did not arrive as a confrontation. It arrived as an email on a Tuesday afternoon, sent from operations, copied to 9 people, written in the flat language that corporations use when they want a decision to sound like weather. 4 of my largest accounts, it said, would be transitioning to new coverage under a strategic realignment. Hawthorne Freight was listed first. The receiving executive was listed as Preston Sterling. There was no meeting, no call, no conversation. I read it twice, closed my laptop, and sat in a parking garage for 10 minutes before I drove home. I went to Nolan Pierce the next morning because he was still, on paper, the man those accounts reported through. His office had a window and a shelf of golf trophies and a photograph of his family at a lake, and he did not look at any of it while we talked. He said the instruction had come down directly from the chief executive's office, not from operations, not from a committee, not from a planning cycle, from Vivian. He used the phrase leadership development portfolio, and he had the decency to look embarrassed by the sound of it in his own mouth. I told him I was not fighting the coverage change. Account ownership moves all the time in this business, and I had inherited plenty of relationships that other people built. That was not the problem. The problem was that the fiscal year had 11 weeks left and those contracts were already signed, already invoiced, already recognized. You can hand someone a relationship going forward. You cannot hand them revenue that was earned behind them. Attribution is not a coat you pass across a table. It is a record of what happened. The following week, in the monthly sales meeting, Vivian Sterling walked to the front of a room of 60 people and spent 4 minutes praising her son for what she called his exceptional work, developing the strategic relationship with Hawthorne Freight. She said it without a flicker. She had a way of speaking that made everything sound like it had already been settled by people more important than you, in a room you would never see. Preston nodded along with the modest expression of a man accepting a compliment he had rehearsed receiving. I sat 6 chairs down and looked at the table. Here is what actually happened with Hawthorne Freight. I made first contact in February after a trade conference where their operations director told me, politely, that they were happy with their current vendor. I called back in April. I sent a maintenance cost analysis in June that nobody asked for. In August, their East Regional line went down, and I drove 4 hours through the night with a field engineer because our competitor could not get anyone out until Monday. In November, they invited us to bid. Preston Sterling attended one dinner, in December, 3 days before signature, and ordered the Branzino. Then Vivian turned in her chair and looked directly at me, and said she was sure I must be delighted to see a younger generation take the work of those who came before and lift it to a higher level. The room went very quiet. 60 people understood exactly what had just been done, and 60 people understood exactly why nobody would say so. I have thought about that moment many times since. There is a particular silence that happens when a group of adults agrees together to pretend they did not hear something. And it has a weight to it, like water above your head. I did not raise my voice. I said that I had no objection to anyone building on my work, as long as the reporting reflected who produced which result. That was all. 9 words that were not a challenge to her authority, only to her bookkeeping. Vivian's expression did not change, but something in the room's temperature did, and Derek told me afterward that he actually felt his stomach drop. She moved on to the quarterly forecast. 20 minutes later, her assistant asked me to come up to the executive floor. Her office was on the 11th floor, and it was beautiful in the way that expensive rooms are beautiful when nobody actually lives in them. She did not sit. She told me I appeared to be having difficulty accepting a new generation of leadership, and that this kind of resistance had a way of following a person through their career. Then she paused, and she looked at the photograph on my badge lanyard, and she said something I have never forgotten. She said that I had a stable job, and that with my family responsibilities, She trusted I understood the difference between what was worth risking and what was not. That was the moment. The whole shape of it became clear to me. She was not simply elevating her son, which would have been ordinary corruption, the kind every large company metabolizes without noticing. She was buying my silence with my daughter. She had looked at my life, identified the thing I could least afford to lose, and set it gently on the table between us where we could both see it. I said thank you for the clarity and I left. In the elevator I noticed my hands were steady, and that surprised me more than anything else that day. 9 days before the gala, the annual leaderboard went out to the entire sales department, as it had every year for 11 years. It was a simple document: rank, name, closed revenue, quota attainment. I was first at 18.7 million. Second was a woman in the Western region at 13.4. Preston Sterling, counting only revenue he had personally originated, was seventh at just under $6 million. Derek sent me a photograph of the screen with no message attached. I looked at it for a long time that night after my daughter had gone to bed. The next morning the file was gone. Not moved, not revised, not appended. The link returned an error and the document had been removed from the internal archive entirely, along with the 2 previous drafts. By 11 o'clock, a new version appeared with a new revision date and no explanation. In the new version, 4 of my closed contracts had been reclassified under a heading I had never seen before in 11 years at that company, called Strategic Corporate Revenue, which by definition was excluded from individual performance attainment. My total dropped by roughly $7 million. The same 4 contracts appeared in a separate column credited to the executive of record for strategic coverage, Preston Sterling. His originated revenue had not changed by a single dollar. What had changed was the definition of the word originated. I fell to second. He rose to first by a margin of $240,000, which is a rounding error in a business our size, and yet was somehow precise enough to be decisive. Whoever built that file had not been careless. They had been careful in a very specific direction. Derek found me in the stairwell, which was where people in that building went when they wanted to say something true. He was furious in a way I could not afford to be. He said they had not beaten me, they had changed the rules after the game ended. I told him that was exactly right, and that it was also the reason I was not going to do anything loud. If you shout about a rule change, you become a story about a man who is upset. If you document a rule change, you become a record. Records outlive moods. So I built a file. Not a lawsuit, not a whistleblower letter, not a manifesto, just an ordinary folder on an ordinary drive containing ordinary things. The original leaderboard saved before deletion, with its metadata intact. The full customer relationship history for all 4 contracts, showing every logged call, every visit, every proposal revision, every note going back 3 years, with my identifier on all of it. The account transfer emails with their timestamps, 12 months of commission statements. The signature dates on every agreement, each of them preceding the transfer by weeks or months. Then I did the thing that mattered most, and it was also the most boring. I wrote 1 email to the finance department, 4 sentences long, entirely without accusation, asking them to confirm in writing the published criteria for the Top Seller of the Year award as issued in January, and to confirm whether those criteria had been amended during the fiscal year. I copied nobody. I used no adjectives. I wanted to know whether this was a system error, because if it was a system error, then it could be fixed by a system, and everyone could keep their dignity. There was no reply. There is never a reply to that email at any company anywhere. But 2 hours after I sent it, Vivian Sterling's assistant called and asked me to come upstairs, and when I walked in, a printed copy of my own message was sitting on her desk, squared neatly against the edge. She let me look at it for a moment before she spoke. She said I was making a simple matter unnecessarily unpleasant. I asked her the only question I had come with. Under the criteria published in January, who won? She did not answer. She sat down, crossed her hands, and told me that I was a good salesman. Then she said the sentence I have heard in my head more times than I would like to admit. "You are a salesman, Grant, nothing more." She said it the way you would state the boiling point of water. Then she added that I should not mistake the fact that customers liked me for the idea that I was more important than the company. I said, "Then let the sales numbers speak." She told me the meeting was over. That afternoon, Human Resources received instruction to prepare the Gala presentation materials, the engraved crystal, and the certificate of achievement with the name Preston Sterling. I know the exact time because 7 weeks later I saw the ticket in an audit exhibit, time-stamped 4:12 in the afternoon, roughly 90 minutes after I left her office. That is the detail I think about when people ask whether she panicked. She did not panic. She simply moved to the next item on a list, the way you would after resolving a shipping delay or a parking dispute. The annual leadership gala was held at a hotel downtown with a ballroom that had chandeliers the size of small cars and a dinner service for 460 people, employees, executives, board observers, and about 30 representatives from our largest customers. I went. Derek asked me twice whether I was sure, and I told him that if I stayed home, the story the following Monday would be that Grant Keller could not handle losing, and that story would follow me longer than the evening would. So I put on the same navy suit I wear to funerals and weddings, and I sat at table 19. They ran the awards in the usual order, saving the largest for last. When the presenter announced the top seller of the year category, the screens behind the stage filled with the year's summary figures, and I noticed something almost immediately. My number was not there, not adjusted downward, not footnoted, not shown in second position. $18.7 million did not appear anywhere on that display. The second place slot showed a figure of 11.3, which corresponded to nothing in any version of any document I had ever seen. They had not just moved the revenue. They had removed the evidence that it had ever been counted. Vivian walked to the microphone in something silver and spoke for 6 minutes without notes. She talked about a new generation of leadership. She talked about strategic thinking and about the difference between people who move product and people who understand where a company is going. She said the future belongs to those who can see past the transaction. Every sentence was a small stone laid on top of the men and women in that room who had spent the year in airports and rental cars and plant parking lots, and she laid them gently, smiling, without ever once saying anything you could quote against her. Then she said her son's name. The applause was strange. It started, then thinned, then swelled again as people remembered where they were and who was watching them. Preston came up the side steps looking genuinely pleased, which was somehow the worst part, and his mother handed him the crystal with one hand and the ceremonial check with the other and kissed him on the cheek in front of 460 people. Derek did not clap. Neither did the 4 people at my table. I clapped twice, slowly, because I had decided in the car that I would give them nothing to describe. I found her afterward in the corridor between the ballroom and the coat check, away from the crowd, standing alone near a service door with a glass of something she was not drinking. I did not raise my voice, and I did not block her path. I asked one question: would the commission records be corrected? She said I would still be paid my base commission on my closed business. I asked about the award. She said the decision had been made. I asked on what criteria, and she looked directly at me, unhurried, and said, on the criteria that I am the chief executive. Then she went further, and I have never fully understood why, except that people who have never been contradicted eventually lose the ability to hear themselves. She said that I ought to be grateful that a person in my position was still permitted to sit in that room at all. She said that I sold things, and that her son built the future, and that I should be careful not to confuse the two. I said, all right. That was the entire content of my response. One word, and I turned and walked back toward the coat check. I did not know until much later that a woman in a charcoal dress had been standing about 20 feet away, waiting for her car, holding her phone against her chest without looking at it. Her name was Rebecca Shaw, and she was the vice president of procurement for Hawthorne Freight, and she had heard the last 90 seconds of that conversation with perfect clarity. She did not approach me. She did not approach Vivian. She got into her car, rode back to her hotel, and the following morning she made a phone call to her own chief executive, who happened to be her father-in-law, and who happened to have known our chairman for 11 years. Monday morning at 8:40, Preston sent an email to the entire commercial organization announcing that effective immediately he would assume executive ownership of Hawthorne Freight and 2 other strategic accounts with expanded coverage responsibilities to be defined in the coming quarter. My name appeared once, in the 3rd paragraph, in a sentence thanking me for my contributions during the transition period. I was reassigned to a portfolio of 19 accounts, none of them larger than $400,000 annually, most of them in the 3rd and 4th tier where new hires start. I did not fight it. I want to be precise about this because people assume there must have been a scene. There was not. I built the transition documents myself, and I built them well. 31 pages of contact maps, escalation histories, pricing rationale, service commitments, contract renewal dates, and the specific personal facts that make a relationship work, like the fact that their maintenance director will not take calls before 9 because he walks his father's dog. I handed it all over. My daughter asked me that week why I seemed calm, and I told her that calm is not the same as finished. The trouble started on the 9th day. Hawthorne Freight requested a meeting, which Preston took as enthusiasm and scheduled as a relationship review. Rebecca Shaw arrived with 2 colleagues and a folder, and according to 3 people who were in that room. The first thing she said after sitting down was, "Where is Grant Keller?" Preston explained that I had moved into a different role, and that Hawthorne would now benefit from senior executive attention at the director level. Rebecca listened to the entire sentence before she answered. She said that Hawthorne had not requested a change in account leadership, had not been consulted about one, and had learned about it from a mass email. She reminded him that 6 months earlier, their entire Eastern distribution network had come within 11 hours of a shutdown during a supplier collapse, and that the reason it did not happen was that one man had rebuilt a parts pipeline out of 3 other regions over a weekend, on his own authority, and then absorbed the freight cost internally rather than pass it along during a crisis. She asked Preston whether he had read that file. He had not. 2 days later, Hawthorne Freight suspended progress on a contract extension valued at $11.8 million, citing continuity concerns pending clarification of account governance. That is the exact language. A second customer, a mid-sized fabrication group in Pennsylvania, sent a shorter and less diplomatic note asking to be assigned back to their previous representative. A third asked for a call and never scheduled it, which in my experience is worse. None of this came from me. I had made no calls. I had sent no messages. I had done exactly what I said I would do, which was nothing at all. Vivian summoned me on a Thursday. She had a printed copy of the Hawthorne suspension notice, and she put her finger on it while she spoke. She said I had made customers dependent on an individual rather than on the strength of the brand, and that this represented a serious failure of professional judgment on my part. I said I had never asked any customer to depend on me. She said that I had also never done anything to prevent it. I remember genuinely considering, for a second, whether she believed what she was saying. I think she did. She then instructed me, with human resources present as a witness, that any unauthorized contact with transferred accounts would be treated as a disciplinary matter up to and including termination. I agreed on the spot, without conditions. It was the easiest promise I have ever made because I had already understood something that Vivian, for all her intelligence, had not. She thought the danger was me talking to customers. The danger was customers talking to each other, and above both of us, in a category she had stopped thinking about entirely, customers talking to the chairman. Everett Caldwell was 67 years old, and he had been chairman of Astron Systems for 9 years, and to most of the people on my floor, he was less a person than a signature at the bottom of the annual letter. He came to headquarters perhaps 4 times a year. He had no relationship with me of any kind. He had never sent me an email, never attended a regional review I was in, and would not have recognized me in an elevator. That fact is important, because it is the reason none of what followed was a favor. The call he received came from Gordon Shaw, the chief executive of Hawthorne Freight, on a Tuesday morning in the first week of February. The two men had known each other since a joint venture in the previous decade, and they spoke maybe twice a year, usually about nothing. Gordon did not call to defend me. He called to say that Hawthorne was reevaluating the scope of its relationship with Astron, and that he wanted Everett to hear it from him directly, rather than through a procurement letter. Everett asked why. He had seen the pipeline projections 3 weeks earlier, and Hawthorne had been marked as an expanding account with a high probability extension. Gordon told him that Astron had replaced the man who built their entire program with the chief executive's son, without notice and without consultation. Everett asked whether he meant Preston. Gordon said yes, and then Gordon added the sentence that turned a customer complaint into an investigation. He said that from what he had heard directly, they had also given the young man an award based on revenue that another person produced. Everett did not defend the company, and he did not agree with the customer, which is the correct instinct in a man who has been on boards for 2 decades. He said he would look into it personally and call back within a week. Then he hung up and did something Vivian never anticipated because it required no confrontation at all. He called the head of internal audit directly on a Tuesday afternoon and requested 5 things in writing without informing the executive office. He asked for the final sales results as published before the Gala and the final results as published after. He asked for the complete relationship management history on all accounts whose ownership had changed in the 4th quarter. He asked for the published award criteria as issued in January, together with any amendments and the approval trail for each. He asked for the exact timestamps of every ownership change in the system of record. And last, he asked for the reporting relationship between the award recipient and every individual who had approved any part of the process. It took the audit team 6 days. The finding that mattered was not complicated and did not require an accountant to appreciate. The revenue reclassification that moved roughly $7 million out of my individual attainment and into a newly created category had been entered into the system 36 hours before the year-end results were locked, not 36 days. 36 hours. The category itself had been created 11 minutes before the first entry was posted to it, and the final approval on every one of those entries carried a single name: Vivian Sterling. Everett called the chief financial officer at home on a Sunday evening. He asked one question first, which was whether any change to award or bonus criteria had been submitted to the compensation committee at any point during the fiscal year, as the governance policy required. The chief financial officer said no. Everett asked whether such a change would ordinarily require that submission. The chief financial officer said yes, without qualification, and then went quiet for a moment and said he had raised a concern in December and been told it was a classification matter, not a compensation matter. Everett thanked him. Then he said, "Do not tell her I asked." Meanwhile, on my floor, none of this existed. What existed was a Tuesday meeting invitation from Human Resources with Vivian's name on the attendee list and no agenda, which in 11 years I had learned to read the way farmers read a sky. I brought nothing with me except a pen. There were 3 people in the room and 1 document face down on the table, and Vivian let the silence sit for a moment before she turned it over, because she was a person who understood that theater is most of management. It was a performance improvement plan. 60 days, 3 cited deficiencies, failure to support an executive account transition, undermining customer confidence in company leadership, a pattern of negative conduct following the annual gala. It was signed by Vivian and countersigned by a director of human relations who did not look up from the table during the entire meeting. At the bottom was a line stating that failure to demonstrate measurable improvement could result in separation. I read all 4 pages while nobody spoke. It took me perhaps 90 seconds. Then I asked my questions, one at a time, in a normal voice. Could anyone provide a specific instance in which I declined to complete a transition task, given that I had personally produced the 31-page handover document? No one answered. Could anyone produce a single email, call log, or customer statement in which I disparaged Preston Sterling or discouraged any client from working with him? No one answered. Was any of the 3 cited deficiencies supported by a dated example that could be attached as an exhibit? The human resources director looked at Vivian. Vivian lost patience, which was the first genuinely useful thing that happened in that room. She said I was working very hard to make myself into a victim. I told her that I was only asking for evidence. She said that I needed to understand that this company did not revolve around Grant Keller. And I told her, quietly, that I had never once suggested it did, and that the only thing I had ever asked for was that the record match the work. She told me to sign. I signed. Underneath my signature, in clear handwriting, I wrote a single line. Receipt does not indicate agreement. Vivian looked at it and gave a short laugh through her nose and said that I always had to have the last word. I said no. I said the file should just be accurate. I do not think she heard it as anything but stubbornness, and that is understandable, because to her a file was a tool you used against people. To me, a file was the only thing in that building that could not be intimidated. I stood up, thanked them for their time, and walked out. I was perhaps 30 feet down the corridor when I heard her office phone ring behind me, and I heard her assistant's voice, and I heard Vivian say, "For what?" I did not slow down. What her assistant had told her was that Everett Caldwell would be at headquarters the following morning at 9. When Vivian asked the reason, her assistant said he had not given one, which was true, and which was also the first thing in 11 weeks that Vivian Sterling could not control. He arrived without an entourage, no communications director, no executive assistant, no advance team. 1 driver, 1 leather folder, and a man in a gray suit who checked in at the front desk like a vendor, because nobody had thought to tell reception he was coming. Vivian met him on the 11th floor with a prepared presentation on growth strategy and market positioning for the coming 3 years, 41 slides, and Preston was in the room, along with Nolan Pierce and the chief financial officer, and 2 vice presidents who had been added that morning to fill the table. Everett listened for about 5 minutes. He asked 1 clarifying question about capital allocation in the southern region, which Vivian answered well. Then he closed the folder in front of him, laid both hands flat on the table, and asked who Grant Keller was. The room did not change temperature so much as change altitude. Nolan told me later that he heard the ventilation system for the first time in 4 years. Vivian answered within 2 seconds, which was itself a mistake, because it revealed she had an answer ready. She said I was a sales executive who was experiencing some difficulty adapting to organizational change. Everett said he had not asked for her assessment. He said he had asked who I was. There was a pause, and then Nolan Pierce, who I will always credit for this even though it cost him nothing, at that point opened his laptop and read the facts aloud. 11 years of service, top 3 in the division for 7 of them. First in the division in the current year. Account lead on Hawthorne Freight since first contact. Vivian interjected that Preston currently held executive ownership of Hawthorne. Everett asked whether Hawthorne had requested that change. Nobody answered. He asked it a second time, exactly the same way, with the same intonation, which is a thing I have since tried to learn how to do. Preston shifted in his chair. Vivian said that customer coverage decisions were an internal management prerogative. Everett said that was not the question either, and then he opened the leather folder and took out 2 printed documents and set them side by side on the table. The first was the leaderboard, as published 9 days before the gala. The second was the leaderboard, as published the following morning. He turned them both to face Vivian and asked her what had happened in the intervening 36 hours. She said the difference reflected a strategic revenue classification adjustment aligning individual attainment with enterprise value creation. It was a beautiful sentence. It meant nothing whatsoever, and everyone in the room knew it, and she delivered it perfectly. Everett asked on what date that classification had been approved by the compensation committee. Vivian said the classification was an accounting treatment, not a compensation change. Everett said the classification determined the recipient of a $75,000 bonus and an equity grant, and asked again for the date. She said she would have to review the timeline. He said the audit had already reviewed it, and that the answer was that no such approval existed, and that the category itself had been created 11 minutes before it was first used. Preston spoke then, for the only time in the meeting. He said he had not been aware of any of that. I believe him, actually. I think he had spent his whole life being handed things by his mother, and had simply never once asked where any of them came from, and that this was the first morning of his life in which that question was asked out loud, in front of witnesses. Vivian told him not to speak. That instruction, delivered to a 28-year-old director in front of the chairman, told Everett more than any document could. Everett then asked the question that Nolan Pierce says he will remember until he dies. He said, "If Preston was the best seller, why did you have to move someone else's sales into his name?" Vivian said that raw revenue figures did not capture leadership potential. Everett said that might well be true and that it was an interesting philosophical position and that the award in question was called Top Seller. He asked whether she would like to propose renaming it. Nobody laughed. He was not joking. Finally, he took out one more page and slid it across the table. It was an email from Hawthorne Freight, sent to him directly, stating in 3 sentences that Hawthorne would not execute the pending $11.8 million extension, nor consider the 2 additional terminals under discussion, unless account leadership was returned to their previous representative. He let her read it. Then he said, "You removed the person who produced the revenue from the account in order to give that revenue to the person who needed the achievement." Vivian said that was one interpretation. Everett said no, that it was what the records showed, and that interpretations were what people offered when the records did not help them. He stood, buttoned his jacket, and told her the board would be in contact within 72 hours. He did not raise his voice a single time during the entire meeting. Several people have told me since that this was the frightening part, and I understand why. Anger is a negotiation. Calm is a conclusion. The internal audit report was completed 11 days later and ran to 63 pages. Its conclusions were narrower than the rumors that swept the floor, and I have always thought that made them more damning. It found no evidence of criminal financial fraud. What it found instead was a material conflict of interest in the administration of a compensation award, an unapproved modification of performance criteria after the close of the measurement period, direct interference with sales attribution records by an executive with a personal beneficiary relationship, a documented pattern of preferential placement in hiring and promotion, and retaliatory performance documentation initiated against an employee who had raised a good faith question in writing. The board convened an emergency session on a Friday. Vivian Sterling was relieved of operational authority pending completion of the review, with immediate effect, which in practice meant her badge stopped working over the weekend. Preston was removed from all strategic accounts and stripped of the top seller designation, and the crystal was returned to the corporate secretary's office in a canvas bag. Nolan Pierce received a formal written warning for failing to escalate a governance concern, which he told me he considered generous and I considered accurate. 12 days after that, they held an all-hands meeting in the same auditorium where the quarterly reviews happened, and Everett Caldwell stood on the same kind of stage where I had watched a trophy with my name behind it go into another man's hands. He spoke for 4 minutes. He said the year-end results had been re-audited and restated. He said that the published criteria issued in January would be applied as published, because that is what published means. Then he read my name. The applause went on a long time, longer than was comfortable, honestly. Derek was standing near the front and he was not clapping, he was just grinning like an idiot with his arms crossed. I walked up the same steps Preston had walked up in December and Everett shook my hand and handed me the crystal, and I stood there holding it and realized that it weighed almost nothing, maybe 2 pounds. I had built the entire winter around an object I could have held in one hand while carrying groceries. So I said, into the microphone, that I appreciated the correction of the record, and that I was grateful. And then I said that the trophy had never been the thing I needed. The room got very quiet, and I could see Everett turn his head slightly, and I understood that I had about 15 seconds of institutional attention that I would never get again in my life, and that I should spend it on something other than myself. I said I wanted 4 things. The bonus paid as committed under the criteria published in January, to me and to anyone else whose attainment had been affected by the reclassification. Commission statements corrected and reissued for the full fiscal year. The performance improvement plan removed from my personnel file entirely, not annotated but removed, along with a written finding of its basis, and a governance rule in the compensation policy prohibiting any retroactive change to performance criteria after the close of a fiscal year for anyone, permanently. Everett said yes to all 4 from the stage, without consulting anyone, which I later learned he did not technically have the authority to do and did anyway. Afterward, he found me near the side door and asked me one question, which was whether I had come to him at any point. I said no. He said he knew, and that he had checked, and that it was the reason he had believed the file. Then he said something I think about often. He said that a man who documents instead of complaining is usually telling the truth, because lying takes less work. 6 weeks after the all-hands, the board announced that Vivian Sterling would be stepping down as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately, to pursue other opportunities. That is the language they use. It was not because of a trophy. The trophy was simply the first thread that anyone had ever pulled, and once it came loose, the whole garment came apart in the auditor's hands over the course of a single quarter. They found preferential placement in 9 hires across 4 years, 2 of them family connections, and the rest belonging to a network of favors. They found 3 instances of bonus adjustment outside the approved framework. They found a pattern of customer escalations that had been closed at the executive level without ever entering the formal complaint system, which meant the board had been reading satisfaction metrics for 2 years that were not measuring anything. And they found 2 regional managers who testified, under an anonymity provision, that they had been pressured to revise completed performance evaluations. None of that had anything to do with me. That is the part I find hardest to explain to people who want this to be a story about revenge. I did not bring her down. I asked one question in writing, and the answer to that question happened to require the destruction of a set of records that other people were then obligated to examine. Everything that followed came out of her own filing cabinets. She was not undone by an enemy. She was undone by the accumulated weight of 11 years of assuming nobody would ever check. Preston was not fired. I want to say clearly that I argued for that outcome whenever it asked me, and that a number of people disagreed with me. Firing him would have been the satisfying thing, and it would also have let him spend the rest of his life believing he had been a casualty of his mother's mistakes rather than a beneficiary of them. Instead, he was returned to an ordinary sales position in the central region with no special title, a standard quota, and a territory of accounts that nobody had prepared for him. They offered me Director of Strategic Accounts in the spring. I did not accept immediately, which surprised Everett. I told him I would take it on one condition, which was that I be given authority to design and enforce a transparent attribution system across the entire commercial division, with rules published in January, locked at the close of the year, and visible to every person whose income depended on them. He asked how long it would take. I said 4 months. He said take 6 and do it properly. A few months later, I walked past the display case in the main lobby on my way to a Monday meeting. The crystal is in there now, on the second shelf, with my name and the year etched into the base, between a safety award from the previous decade and a plaque from a supplier association. I looked at it for maybe 2 seconds. Derek was walking with me and he stopped because he wanted me to stop, and he asked whether after everything I still did not feel anything about it. I told him the trophy had not changed anything. He said that seemed like an odd position for a man who had just gotten it back, and he started listing things. Vivian lost the chief executive role. Preston lost the title. I got promoted, I got the bonus, I got the file cleaned. He said that sounded like quite a lot of change for an object that changed nothing. I looked at the crystal through the glass for a moment longer than I meant to. Then I told him the truth, which is that the thing that changed everything was not the award and was not the chairman and was not the customers. It was the moment the record stopped being something they could edit. Everything before that was opinion. Everything after that was arithmetic. Vivian Sterling could outrank me, out-earn me, outmaneuver me, and humiliate me in front of 460 people, and none of it mattered once the timestamps existed in a place her password could not reach. The new policy went live on the first day of the new fiscal year. I presented it in a conference room to my division, 41 people, most of them younger than me, several of them looking at their phones. The first line on the screen read that no performance criteria may be changed retroactively after the fiscal year closes. Under it were the 11 other provisions, about publication dates, about approval trails, about the right of any employee to request written confirmation of criteria, and to receive a written answer within 10 business days. My name is not on that policy anywhere. I made sure of it during drafting, and the corporate secretary thought I was being modest, and I was not. Rules that belong to a person die when that person leaves. Rules that belong to nobody just sit there, boring and permanent, protecting people who will never know they are being protected and never need to know. That is the actual prize. It has no engraving, and it does not go in a case in a lobby. At the other end of the building, on the 11th floor, the nameplate that read Vivian Sterling, Chief Executive Officer, came off the wall on a Thursday afternoon, and the small holes where the screws had been were filled and painted over within a week. Nobody made a ceremony of it. That is how those things actually end, in my experience, without a speech and without a scene, just a maintenance ticket and a can of touch-up paint that does not quite match the wall. And I sit now at a table where decisions get made about how 140 people will be measured and paid, and I got there for none of the reasons anyone would guess. Not because a powerful man decided to be kind to me, not because I knew someone, not because I fought harder, or shouted louder, or held a secret in my back pocket the whole time. I got there because when every convenient story had been stripped away, The numbers were still sitting there, exactly where the work had left them, and this time nobody is allowed to rewrite them.